Dr. Nancy Crupi. I'm a biologist with 15 years of academic research experience internationally, and I've been working on a lot of different things, and ultimately I have also had to overcome a lot of personal challenges. I'm here to guide you towards awakening and ego death. Ego death and trauma healing are the most important tasks we need to accomplish today for humanity. The second season of the New Earth podcast is going to be specifically focused on giving you stories so that you see the trails and what kind of breadcrumbs you need to follow for you to reach your own ego death, for you to reach your own trauma healing, and for you to embody your highest self finally. Let's start. Hello, everyone, and welcome again to a new episode of the New Earth podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about what the ego is and what the ego death is supposed to be. Because this season is going to be talking about specifically about the ego death, not just about that, because the whole purpose of this podcast is to give you guys exposure to different kinds of healing modalities that have nothing to do with Western healthcare, so that you really go back to the roots of the real healing, the real healers, the real medicine, instead of what we have today, unfortunately. And so through that, by giving you guys exposure to people who have become healers, I'm also going to give you exposure to a lot of different stories of ego death or healing or trauma healing. And ultimately, ego death, what is ego death? Ego death is not just a station you arrive at, right? It's really, like, it sounds quirky, but it's really a manner of traveling, in the sense that it's really the way in which you face the world and you face your challenges and you make choices in your life. First of all, what is the ego? So I talked in the previous episodes and also in the previous season, and I suggest you to check it out, to check those episodes out. And I talked about the ego in various ways. One of those is a way that has to do with physics, because ego has to do with physical. Everything is a physical phenomenon, in our physical universe. At the same time, there is a lot to do with, there are different levels, and what happens physically ultimately also has a psychological component and a physical component in terms of physiological component. And so from a physical standpoint, I would like for people to really imagine, I have this here, this is perfect. Well, it's not exactly perfect, but you'll see what I mean. So now imagine you are a ball of Play-Doh, which is this black ball that I have that is spongy. Imagine it's made of Play-Doh, right? And imagine this ball suddenly at some point gets hit by an arrow on one of the sides. So what happens is that on the opposite side, you're gonna have a protrusion that is the shape of that arrow, right? And on the inside instead, you're gonna have a hole, right, that has the shape of that arrow. So trauma is the arrow that penetrates us, and us, we are the ball. And so what is the ego in this transaction, in these things that happen? The ego is that protrusion on the opposite side. You see, this was a ball. For how they built it, this was a ball in a sense. And then by making this shape, they've transformed it into something that is caved inside. And then on the opposite side, it has the same shape as the hole that it hides. And so this is really what the ego is. The ego is the external layer that we put up, we create to compensate, to cope with the trauma that hurt us in some way. And so what is this trauma? Like the last episode, I talked about my dog and talking about deep unresolved trauma. Now, not all trauma is deep and unresolved, but what causes the ego is deep unresolved trauma, because if you had resolved that trauma, you would have not had an ego in the first place. And we can go as far as the beginning of everything, the beginning of the Big Bang. So everything really started with when the universe has been created through the Big Bang, it started expanding through the Big Bang. So before the Big Bang, now we don't have data on that, obviously, but before the Big Bang, everything we can infer from various kinds of physical studies and theories and equations and all kinds of research in physics, we can infer that before the Big Bang, the universe was just a ball of something, was a unique object. And then after the Big Bang, something happened that caused the universe to start having all these different forms and being and feeling separate and feeling all these shapes. Us, we animals that walk around the planet, houses, plants, planets that revolve and rotate, and the universal revolution of things. So all of that, all these separate objects really originated from the Big Bang, because initially there was nothing like that. Initially it was only one thing. The universe was just one ball. Now the universe is all of these things, but the problem is that the consciousness of the universe also goes into all of these objects. And so I have my consciousness, you have your consciousness, and our mind, and we all have a mind. And we all, because we are trapped in this body, we feel separate, but we ultimately come from one thing, and we still are one thing. We just forgot because we are trapped in these bodies. So that is really deep unresolved trauma that the entirety of humanity has. Everything in nature has that trauma, which is the trauma of forgetting of being one, the trauma of not remembering that we come from one object, and that yes, we're split, yes, now we talk to each other, yes, now we fight against each other, but we're just one. We're just the universe talking to itself, fighting against itself. It's nonsense. It's really nonsense. But until you realize that you live in this fictitious reality in which you are, this Nancy body, or this Aaron body, or like any kind of person feels separate. Everybody feels separate. So that is the real deep unresolved trauma that has caused the ego of feeling like this world even exists, in a sense. This reality even makes sense. We are finite, we are about to die. Everybody's about to die. And instead we are this eternal being that just changes shape and creates bubbles on top of each other, and it creates things that get reabsorbed, but the consciousness of the universe never changes. We're just pieces of it that detach and then go back to it. But then we never actually die. It's just the universe never actually dies. And so this is the real trauma, the deep unresolved trauma that we all have and we need to heal, and that created the surface. Our body itself is the ego that we're talking about. But before going to that, and you are like, yeah, I know about this. I know that I'm just separate. But knowing about that and actually feeling that is completely different. Because what happens is that the ego is not just about a belief system. The ego is being conscious of that belief system, whether that belief system is true or not. So the egoic mind believes that we are separate. The egoic mind believes that we are here, because the egoic mind is in a part of the brain that can only perceive things as separate, because the egoic mind is in a part of the brain that resonate that things in a binary way. You see, so the egoic mind is in a part of the brain, which is the amygdala, the basal ganglia, and like all parts of the reptilian and limbic brain, that ultimately cause us to really perceive the world as made of these discrete objects. We perceive the world as discrete. Well, it is a discrete. Discrete means that we perceive the pixels on the screen. We don't perceive the continuum of the spectrum of things. We perceive everything as separate. We do see the world as separate. I can see people that walk in the street, and I don't see anything that joins them, anything that unites them. I see just separate objects that move around. So that's my egoic mind. That's how we perceive things. And it's all about our perception, right? Our perceptions are guided by what we need as forms until we are in this body. So until we are in this body and we only use our physical brain, our physical body to think and to do and to function, we're only going to be able to perceive things as separate, because our body can only get that far. Our body can only perceive the discrete things, because that's what the body needs on it for itself, right? Our body doesn't need to perceive a whole continuum spectrum. Actually, it will be detrimental for the body, in a sense, if we will see that everything is a continuum of shape and form of energy, and we just live in this ocean in which every once in a while there is a fish, which is a more dense form, and every once in a while there is a seaweed, which is a more dense form, and then the rest is like plankton, and then there is just ocean. This is how the earth will look like if you will look at it from a perspective that is outside of the body, just a continuum of things that has to do with things that are more dense, things that are lesser dense, and that's really what it is. Imagine if you were a fish, and if you will ask a fish, can you tell me what color the water is? The fish will tell you what is water. Because for the fish, water doesn't exist. Because for the fish to survive in the water, the fish doesn't need to see the water. The fish just sees through it as much as we see through the air. And so for us, as much as for a fish, the medium in which we live is not relevant. It's not relevant for our survival, because it's not something we can change. That is a constant. And so whenever things are constant, such as consciousness, such as eternity, such as we as our bodies don't perceive it, because it's a constant. Why would you perceive something that never change, right? And so same thing for the fish. The fish perceives when there is dirt in the water, because so the fish perceives the dirt. We perceive the pollution, we perceive the clouds, we perceive, when people act different. But things that are constant, we don't perceive them unless we truly get out of this egoic modality. We truly get out of the water. Then we look at us in the water. We're like, oh, that's what the water was, right? So this is what it means to really overcome that kind of ego. The ego that really is the ultimate form of ego that we need to overcome, which is understanding we're just part of this mass, this huge mass, and we're just a tiny little dot in it, trying to kind of figure out what to do and how long we can survive in this shape, forgetful that we are the whole thing, because we have these separate bodies that force our consciousness to be trapped in them. And because of that, we can't connect with others as we would have done before when we were still one. So now to connect with others, we need to use the holes in our body. Yes, this is what we do. We use the holes in our body to create junctions with others through our voice, through our ears, through our vaginas, through our everything. Everything is just a way to reconnect with the universe, like pieces in a puzzle. And so we can connect with others again by using the filters that this body allows, and that allows the inner part of us to get out and to get out on the outside. Through our voice, you express to people, I love you. And so, because of that, we bond with them. And so now we have created a connection. But that connection was already there. It's just that we have forgotten about that. And now we have to make people aware that that connection exists. And to do that, we need to use our words, or we need to listen to them. And so they create a connection from their mouth through our ears, and we create connections with them. So this is how humanity creates connections, by creating bonds and creating relationships and creating things. But those connections can be really going back to the source, which is love, or it can be very egoic as well, like fraternities, organizations that are really not, that are mostly egoic and they're not meant to do anything good in the world. And so those things can be very egoic instead. Or, there's so many ways in which humanity creates connections that are really fake. They're really not about your true self. How many times have you told people, I love your pants? And you just want to bond with them, and yet that's nice. But also we do a lot of these things, we do a lot of these things in which we tend to just transform, discretize our communication so that it becomes egoic. It stops being a continuum. What is a continuum? A continuum is when you're capable of just being a vessel for truth, being a vessel for truth. And so you can just be a vessel by saying exactly what you think, which is, I saw you in the street and I feel lonely and I feel like I would love to validate the fact that you put those pants on today, because I would have loved for people to do the same to me. And I think you're beautiful. This is the truth behind, I love your pants. And even the tone of voice we use to say these things is oftentimes just, oh my gosh, I love you. What is this? This is a discretization, an objectification of something that was not egoic before. And it was just like, I love you. I want to be with you. I want to be your friend. So we tend to do a lot of these things at work, in our families. We tend to just discretize. What is discretization in society? Because the ego cannot perceive the continuum, can only perceive things that are as discrete as the ego is, as separate as the ego is. And because of that, everything that is egoic really takes the shape of something that is discrete, is like an object. It's like the same thing as, going in a new building and bringing gifts to everybody just to please everybody, or bringing gifts to everybody because you feel like you love them. And these are two the same exact action, but one is very egoic and you're just like doing it because your mom did it before, you saw your mom doing it with your neighbors before, so why not? You should do the same, or everybody does it, or people expect you to do that. And so you do that because it's an object. There are no feelings attached. It's just a protocol that you're applying, right? It's just, and you go there and you don't even connect with them. You just do that, right? And instead you can do the same thing and be like, I'm getting an object that I think they really will love and can be very useful for them, and I want for them to be happy, so let me do that. And it's a completely different thing, and it's the exact same action instead. And so we do this all the time. So every time we act through our ego, it's when we do things that are just discrete or objectified, or really don't come from the true joy, the true vessel of divine force that we are, but come from fear, the fight or flight modality, the fear of being separate. And because if you're separate, then you're finite and you're alone and the world is hostile and you have to survive. And so you need to build connections with people so that you put roots. So that's the ego. And instead, what consciousness is like, hey, I think people have forgotten that we are just one. Let me reestablish these connections so that we remember of being one step at a time. And again, this is the same action made in two completely different ways. But how do you get out of this egoic modality? If we live in a society that is egoic, but it's really not about that. It's really more about the part of your brain that you're using at any given time. Because you see, like, consciousness is not just about, as I said at the beginning, it's not that you're like, oh, I don't want to be my ego. I know that the ego doesn't exist, that it's false. I know all of this already. And I know, right? But knowing it and feeling it, it's different, because knowing it means that you're still in your egoic mind, but you're trying to tell your egoic mind, hey, you stay calm, because I think you're getting paranoid for nothing. And instead, going in your conscious part of the brain is a completely different experience, because then you feel the oneness and you overcome. And when you see people acting in their ego, you see that and you just patiently wait, and you're like, okay, let me see, let them allow them to patiently, allow them to disperse their own energy of the trauma of the Big Bang to get back to themselves. Let me give them the time to do that. And in the meantime, I'm going to be kind, because they've just forgotten that we're one. And so this is a completely different way of thinking. It's not just a belief. It's not just a belief that you try to incept into your brain, but you don't actually believe it. It's the embodiment of that belief. So that is really reaching the ego death in a sense. But there are a lot of different layers that we need to peel off before getting to that. And even after that, there are more layers to peel off, because even that is still part of the body. And so then with meditation, we can reach levels of consciousness in which we truly access the divine dimension, the higher levels of consciousness, our ancestor line. So all of these things that are there outside of our ego, that is our body, outside of our egoic mind, outside of time, the concept of time that is merely egoic. So outside of that, but to reach that part, you need to really overcome your body. And I mean, I don't know about after death, because I don't remember my past lives. I don't remember my past death experiences. And so I don't know how it is after we get out of the body. But in the meantime that we are in the body, we can definitely access higher levels of consciousness. And maybe they're not the highest, maybe there are higher levels that you can reach once you become just energy and you stop being trapped in this body. But I think with meditation, and I've done it by myself, I had a Kundalini awakening, and that's really to getting out of the body and getting to remember the oneness. That's what the Kundalini awakening ultimately is about. It's about getting out of that kind of mindset, of the mindset of really feeling that you identify with this body, and remembering of being the whole universe. That's really what the Kundalini awakening does. It reactivates parts of the brain, the cortical parts of the brain, that are needed to feel that feeling, that are needed to really embody that belief, instead of simply trying to, feed it with a spoon to your ego that is never going to understand it. And so obviously feeding to your egoic mind those ideas, even if the ego cannot understand them, at the same time you're also feeding those ideas to your body, to your conscious part of the brain. And so the more you feed those ideas to your mind, the more you start really walking towards the ego death, and you get to a point where you start peeling off those layers. So everything is functional to the journey. Nothing is useless, in the sense that obviously don't stop telling yourself that you're not separate, that the ego doesn't exist. Keep doing that. Also understand that that is just a beginning. It's just a beginning, and you're gonna find yourself at some point in which you're gonna feel this feeling of just being infinite and being one with everything, and you're gonna get there. And sometimes it's just something that just happens for a second. It's just a millisecond, like a blink, that you have that feeling. You poked a hole into consciousness, and you're like, wow, that was incredible. And that's how it feels. At the beginning is just really like a millisecond of a feeling that almost makes you feel uncomfortable, because you're like, wow, this is a completely different feeling. My life doesn't make any sense if this feeling is true. You're not getting crazy. This is exactly what an ego death is. And so a lot of times, unfortunately, in the past, people who had ego deaths were labeled as crazy and as schizophrenic, and were put in hospices. This is unbelievable. But we have done that for a long time, because there are people on our planet who can awaken, and people who cannot in this lifetime. And those people are the same that then become the abusers, the oppressors, because they keep expanding up to a certain point of growth and power, but they don't realize that that's not it. That's still their ego. They don't realize that there is something else that they need to do. And power can be a poison also, in the sense that people feel like, oh, this is amazing. It's like it feeds your ego. It feeds you to stay in that gravitational attraction towards your ego. And so those people then become so powerful and so rich and so capable of pushing down others, that then they are the ones who prevent others from going through the ego death and from awakening and from spreading the light of consciousness on the world. And now through time, a lot of time and a lot of wars and a lot of oppression and overcoming it, we have finally reached a number, like people who have awakened and who are really going towards the ego death. We have finally reached a number that we can finally shine the light of consciousness on the world, and that when we are oppressed, we have a voice. Not everywhere in the world, unfortunately. In the United States, even if it sounds like a very, very advanced country, also is incredibly oppressive against people who awaken and who become conscious, because this place is a farm, really, like as many other countries. Most nations are today farms, because the farm is a strategy of the ego. You see, the ego has a lot to do with survival. And so we went through a lot of different things in history, because that's how the ego thinks. That's how the ego evolves. And the ego is a result, again, of this trauma that travels across the universe, the trauma of the Big Bang. Ultimately, why is this, the same object that I showed at the very beginning? What is this hole? What is this hole here? This hole is the trauma of the Big Bang. When the Big Bang, the universe was a ball. When the Big Bang happened, it caused a trauma to the universe. And so everything, every shape, every form in the universe, us as well, it's empty inside. We literally are empty inside. Our peritoneum, our entire body, this entire part, obviously we have organs, but what I mean is, we have this cavity. We have this cavity, and then inside of that cavity, other things happen. It's like we have this garden of beautiful organs, but we have a cavity at the beginning. So everything in the universe is made exactly like this. It has, an egoic shape, the superficial shape that appears to be beautiful and perfect and separate, and an inside that is made of this, that is really the trauma of the Big Bang that travels across us, that pushes us to expand in cycles, to expand and grow and then go back, expand and grow and then go back to the earth. This is what happens to all forms of nature, like from plants to animals to mushrooms. Everything grows, expands, and then goes down, grows, expands, and then goes down. And so this just simply reflects the same that is happening to everything in the universe, that grows, expands, and then goes down in this universal gravitation that we go through. And so this is to say that the ego really is in everything, and that people don't understand that through history we have gone through all the things we have gone through because we're simply dispersing this trauma. We're gonna get to a point where all of this trauma that we are dispersing is gonna end. The energy of it is gonna end, and the reason this doesn't mean that we are not gonna be expanded. Life is not gonna exist anymore. We're just gonna go towards a different type of consciousness of being. We're just gonna go towards a being that is more united, and we're going towards that already. And the most interesting part for me is the fact that really is not just about stopping to expand. It's more about a bread that grows in the oven, and then when it's ready, it gets really hard and thick and good and ready to be eaten. And I feel like that's really what is happening to the universe, in the sense that it's expanding to the point that it reaches its shape that it's supposed to keep for a while. And so what we're doing is really we're being baked, in a sense, to the point that we reach the actual shape we're supposed to have, and once we reach it, we feel at peace. And that has to do also with our brain, the activation of our brain. As I always say, we have these, the innermost parts of the brain are the parts that are very unevolved, in a sense. They're very ancient. Most animals have the reptilian brain, and that's why it's called reptilian brain, and the limbic brain. And then the cortical brain, which surrounds them, is really the part that once we are fully baked, that's ready. But right now we're not fully baked. And so right now that part of the brain is very, very delicate and very sensitive to stress. And so not all humans have a cortex that is capable of growing enough to reach the level of consciousness. And not all humans go through the things that they need to go through in order for them to activate their cortical brain and to make it grow and become sturdy and ready, right? And so it's really about that. It's really about, going from the inside to the outside to the point that it's fully baked, golden brown, ready and crunchy. So really, this is how it is like, especially on Earth, because our planet is a planet that is literally from the inside out, is a planet that is actively heating up. And so the core of the Earth is actually a very, very hot center. It has a very, very hot center. I don't even remember how many degrees, but it's basically, there's lava in the center of the Earth. Like, it's really like, that's why volcano erupt, because they emit out some of the things that come from the Earth. But I feel like most people don't understand that we are the result of the heat of the Earth that really disperses out. Everything that happens on planet Earth ultimately has to do with this energy, these waves of energy. Imagine this inside that really boils and boils and boils, and because it boils, it's like it releases this heat, has to go somewhere. So the Earth simply is dispersing this heat towards the surface in waves of heat, energy. What is heat? Is energy, right? And so we are the result of these waves that allow us and force some pieces of matter on this planet to pop out and then go back. And I always make this analogy that people make fun of because I'm Italian. And so my analogy is that imagine the Earth as a pan of sauce with sauce in it that is simmering on the stove, right? So imagine this. Now imagine that because of this heat that comes from the inside of the planet, the surface starts simmering and boiling. And so bubbles start forming on the Earth. And then every bubble, because of this heat, starts detaching from the sauce and flying out of the sauce and then going back to it. And every time a bubble, imagine how these bubbles start having ice. And every time a bubble pops out of the sauce, thinks, I'm being born. And then every time a bubble starts going back to the sauce due to gravity, it's like, oh my gosh, I'm about to die. I have to not die. So this is us. This is us. We have forgotten. Everything in the universe have forgotten. We're just pieces of the Earth that detach from it. And even if there are a lot of people who believe that the life is being seeded on this planet from other planets. Now, I want you to imagine this, okay? I want you to imagine the universe as a garden of trees in which planets are like flowers, okay? So imagine that every planet can create its own pollen, and every planet can receive the pollen from other planets. So even if we have received, and this is actually what happens in the sense that every planet, like planet Earth, why do you think we're going to Mars now? Why do you think we are pushing all of these things out in the sky? This is, again, the push from the Earth that expresses on the surface. Initially, slowly, it doesn't have the strength to push out things that go anywhere past its own gravitational attraction. And so it creates plants, and then it creates animals that instead have the strength to detach. And then initially it's fish, and then it starts creating animals that go past the ocean and can go on the land and can roam around a little more freely. And then they can create things. They can like shuttles that can go past the gravitational attraction of the planet and go on other planets. So it takes time for this energy to reach the point of creating things that emerge and emerge and emerge more and more and more until it becomes a pollen that goes towards potentially other planets. So even if we have been colonized by people coming from other planets a long time ago, or even if people coming from other planets have come and enslaved us a long time ago, that doesn't really make any difference from a universal standpoint, in the sense that we are all the universe. And even if they are from another universe, still we are in this universe right now. So it doesn't really matter where life comes from. We're eating the earth. We are the earth. Like, you are what you eat. So if you eat the earth, like things that come from the earth, you are the earth. You're a piece of the earth that just, you're taking around molecules that come from this planet, and then you're giving it back to it. And so if you were not the sauce at the beginning, you still are the sauce now. So this is ultimately to go back full circle to, with this very Italian analogy of the tomato sauce, which I never said is a tomato sauce, by the way. I feel like everybody imagines this tomato sauce. I never said that, but I do imagine that as a tomato sauce as well. So you guys are right. So just this to say that this is the main egoic part of us that we need to overcome. But to overcome that may be a little more difficult from a conscious perspective, in the sense that to actually be conscious of that, oftentimes we need to undergo a Kundalini awakening of some sort, or we need to have really experiences that force us and allow us to develop our cortical brain, right? And so that is really something that has to do a lot with our physiology. But there are a lot of different layers of the ego death, which have to do more with awakening from a lot of different things that we do. For example, the choice that I talked about during the deep unresolved trauma episode and during the previous episode as well. Every time we're put in front of choices and we choose the lies instead of the truth, then that lie is basically another branch of the trauma that branches out. So imagine everything in the universe is a fractal. What is a fractal? Let me see if I can show you in my book. Ta-da! Here is the book. I want to show you what a fractal actually is, so that you can guys understand. So this is a fractal. What is a fractal? A fractal is basically something that reiterates the same function over and over and over. So now the function on a tree is, for example, to branch out. So for every branch, it branches out into two. And then for every branch, it branches out into two. And then for every branch, it branches out into two. So you see that it's simply doing the same exact thing over and over and over a lot of times, right? And to the point that it gets the leaves. To the leaves, and then the leaves have their own vessels in which every vessel branches out and every vessel branches out. So this is really what a fractal is. Everything in the universe is a fractal. We are fractals as well. I suggest you get this book, by the way, because it's very interesting. And this is how I designed the human fractal, which is a very interesting way of seeing humans. We are fractals in a lot of different ways, because we also are we're like sea stars, in which we branch out, and then our hands branch out, and then our feet branch out, and then our organs are made exactly in a fractalian way, because all the ducts in our body, our circulatory system and everything are really made in ways that are ultimately fractals. Our brain, everything inside of us is really a fractal. These are neuronal cells. So this is important to say, our lungs, everything is just really a ramified version of a fractal, right? And so every time we make the choice of not being aligned with the truth in our mind, we branch out. We branch out, and we branch out psychologically speaking. Instead of branching out in a way that is, instead of staying in the truth, we branch out to create all of these ego. Because again, even if it sounds contradictory or goes against itself in a sense, ultimately our body is the result of a trauma. Our body is the result of believing of being separate. Our body is the result of the trauma of the Big Bang, the travels, right? And so from a psychological standpoint as well, if we keep choosing lies and lies and lies and lies all the time, we keep just simply branching out and branching out. And it may appear like growth, but reality is that we are simply going away from the feeling of oneness that we once had. And that feeling was the feeling of joy as well. Like the feeling of oneness, of feeling you are eternal, feeling that you are this incredible, powerful being that the universe is. It's not comparable with the feeling of fear that we feel as humans on this planet. So even if we're like, I don't want to give away this body, I don't want to give away what I have, I don't, from a psychological standpoint, reality is that all these feelings are really much, much worse and tiny and small and little and really disempowered as compared to the feeling of being the universe. And you can have the feeling of being the universe even by having a body if you are in the right parts of your brain. There is a beautiful book that I suggest everybody to read or listen to. The title of the book is Whole Brain Living. So this woman, basically, she was interestingly enough, she was a neurobiologist at Harvard, and she had a stroke that damaged her brain. And so as a neurobiologist, she has experienced what it actually feels to when your brain goes through the injuries that she had studied in theory. And so she has been able, through her own experience, to report what every single part of the brain does. Now, not every single part, but like all the parts that were damaged. And so she has experienced for real the feeling of feeling the oneness of the universe, because for a long time only one part of her brain was working and not the other parts. And so she really felt, like she describes in the book, that she felt like a huge ball of energy, and she could not even live in the world. Like she was constantly having to stay in bed because she was not functional. She was not functioning in a world. You can't live in our egoic society by feeling that you are a ball of energy, because she had no capability of perceiving her surroundings and herself as a body that she was as well. And so we have all of these feelings inside of us, but we need to use all of them in a conscious way. That means that going through an ego death doesn't mean you don't know you are the body anymore. It means you have discovered all of the things that I'm saying, and now you are consciously embodying your body, because in this world you need to do that. And then you talk to people and you realize that they are in their ego. And instead of, creating drama and going against them and doing things against them, you're like, okay, so I have to do this because now it's the right time to do this, or maybe let me be patient with them. Or it's a completely different way of existing when you are in a conscious mind as compared to when you are in the drama of the ego. In the drama of the ego, you do things out of fear. In the conscious mind, you do things out of, this is what I have to do because this is what helps the universe keep expanding and healing from the trauma of Big Bang, and reminding everybody that we are one, because that's the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is to remember that we are one, is to awaken and to remember that we are one. But for us to reach that goal, given that most people have not reached it and they really are into this drama, and so they keep causing wars and destroying ourselves, we keep poking holes on our own bodies as a universe because we forgot of being the universe. We keep poking holes on the earth and destroying the earth because we have forgotten of being the earth. And so because people keep doing that, then people who awaken need to compensate and be like, okay, let me see what to do with this person, which is simply like a cancer cell who has forgotten that we are one. What do I do with this? And we need to handle all of these things, because some parts of the body of humanity has really started to spread as a wound spreads, and we need to fix it. And so being awakened doesn't mean not doing anything and sitting on your chair every day because you're like, we're one, right? Yes, we are, but I feel like awakening is like discovering you have an injury that you didn't know about, and now that you do, you're like, okay, my purpose is healing now, because I realize that I am the whole and that parts of me are wounded and I need to heal them. And so that's why people who awaken tend to become healers. And that's why these podcast interviews, for most parts, healers. Like everybody who awakens becomes a healer. Everybody in different ways, because some people heal in a holistic way. Some people heal through their books. Some people heal through their music. Everybody heals others in different ways. But once you heal and you stop being in this drama of the ego, then you can heal others. You can heal the other parts of you that have forgotten of being the whole, and that because of that, they're spreading the wound. They're trying to colonize it as a cancer. They're like behaving against the whole instead of together with it, instead of as parts of it. And so this is really the highest form of ego death you can have, which is something that usually takes a lot of other layers to achieve. And some of those layers have to do with really making these choices daily. Like, when you see that you make choices that have nothing to do with your inner truth and that go against your inner truth, and that oftentimes instead takes you really far from your truth and more closer to a lie that doesn't really exist, then you should question yourself and be like, this is my ego, this is my fear. Like, why would I not be aligned with myself? If I, why would I lie, first of all? And so once you start doing that, then you're like, okay, let me try to realign. And that choice, and that's why I said that going through the ego death is a manner of traveling, because going through the ego death is not just one thing. It's like, it's the choice of just trying to understand, why am I doing this? Why is this happening? Why is this happening around me? And for most people, the ego death begins with seeing the ego in others, because seeing the ego in ourselves is like, it takes a lot more. It depends, because some people do have ego death experiences about their own ego, but usually that happens through very, very shocking trauma, sudden traumatic experiences. And so, but most of the times we tend to awaken to the ego when we go through narcissistic abuse, for example. So it starts like that. It starts when we get bullied, when we get abused, when we get manipulated, and we awaken from that reality, that fictitious reality. Once we awaken from that fictitious reality, which is like the ego, right? It leverages on the same parts of our brain and on the same exact mechanisms. And so this is really how we tend to awaken. We start seeing that, and then we see that people are manipulating us, and we're like, okay, this reality does not exist, or what is the truth? And then you realize the truth, which is that you were being manipulated and you have blind spots. So once you understand that, then you start seeing how the ego inside of you functions in the same exact way. Also, the ego manipulates you. The ego, like, as much as victims of narcissistic abuse develop Stockholm syndrome and their Red Cross syndrome and PTSD and all those things associated with narcissistic abuse and trauma of that sort, then once they start awakening from that, they see they are capable of awakening from the same mechanisms that their ego uses towards them. Because as much as narcissistic people tend to, and we're narcissistic people are people who have fully stepped into their ego to the point that they don't even, they believe they are their ego. And so they're very dysfunctional. But because of that, they create all of these lies. Every choice they make is unsustainable, and they branch out into this antimatter kind of thing in which everything they do is based on a lie. And so it bites itself after a while, like it's like gets back to them, because these choices are not truthful, and so everything gets back to them at some point. It's just a matter of time. And that's why narcissistic people tend to have a lot of victims along their life, because every victim at some point awakens, or people tend to awaken, or things, in Italy we say lies have short legs. Like, lies have short legs. And so lies ultimately never last forever, because they don't exist. They're not the truth. Only the truth exists, and so the lies are short-lived. And so people do that all the time, but by creating this fictitious reality in which then they drag their victims, then their victims, once they awaken to these things, then they awaken to their own ego at the same time. And so at the same time, or at least later on, they tend to awaken from their own ego. And so they start seeing how their ego has the same kind of mechanism, because also the ego, as much as narcissistic people tend to feed the ego of their victims, to make sure that they get into the egoic reality as well, and to really love bomb them at the beginning, and to make them feel important for being their partners, or for being their, their friends or their family members, for being close to them, and for allowing them to get narcissistic supply from them. They make them feel special. It's how it begins. They make you feel special and grandiose and incredible for being their victim. And so you don't see that you're the victim. And so this is how it works at every level in society, from governments to corporations to customers, patients. Everybody is made feel special by those who are abusing them. And that's how narcissistic abuse works. In the same way, our ego does that with us as well. And so we also are constantly convinced of being beautiful because we have this body, forgetting that this body is in itself the symptom of the fact that we have been traumatized as a universe, and that this body is in fact the symptom, that is the embodiment of the fact that we are not one, that we are not eternal, that we are not, and so our body is the source of this feeling of not being eternal, of not being infinite, of not being powerful. But because we have made it into a pretty shell, then we have Stockholm syndrome towards our body. And so now we think we have to keep it. We think we have to stick with it. We have to love it. We have to adorn it. And don't get me wrong. Obviously, self-love is fundamental. But what I'm talking about is something different. I'm talking about people who believe that their body is more important, plastic surgery and all these sort of things. Like, I'm talking about people who believe that their body is all they have. I've seen, have you ever seen all those dating apps in which people, the classic guy with blue eyes who stares at the camera and makes sure that he stares at the camera in all pictures to show everybody that he has blue eyes? I'm like, yourself, you come down to having blue eyes, you think you have nothing else to offer than having blue eyes? That's what I'm talking about. When people start believing that they have nothing else to offer other than their physical self, forgetful that they're the whole universe. This is a completely different feeling, right? It's a completely different feeling, like we're the universe. And so this is the same mechanisms that the ego uses in society and in relationships are the same that then the ego uses inside of our head. And I'm going to be talking about that in my book, Kill Jesus, A Guide Towards the Ego Death. And the same mechanisms have to do with, as I was saying at the beginning, and I did the whole circle to get back to it, really has to do with our evolution, the evolution of society went. Because society is the expression of the ego, right? We live in apartments, we live in things, and we don't see that. But really, as much as our body is made of cells, and each cell stems out of another cell, another cell, another cell, what do you think apartments are? Aren't apartments like a bunch of bubbles, all like cells put close to each other in a conglomerate as much as cells in our body? Isn't this the same thing? Just because they're square, we don't realize that. And so really we have followed the same evolution. And so the evolution of the ego is like a dictator in a sense. Because the ego sees things only black and white, because the part of the brain that the ego uses only sees in black and white, only sees binary, 0 or 1. That's how it works, because that's how fractals work. When a fractal has to expand, where does it expand? Expands towards the path of lower resistance, right? And so if a crack has to expand in the universe and creates the hole, right, that we have inside, then it expands in the path of lower resistance, right? And so that's how it expands, how it works. And so to do that, it has to work in a 0-1 kind of way, because every time it has simply to choose these two binary choices. Which direction do I take? This or this, this or this, this or this. And so these are the choices I'm talking about. So every time the ego is the one that chooses the lower path of lower resistance, which is the lie, right? The lie as lower resistance, but ultimately is also short-lived. And at the same time, in history, what we have done is is basically we have used our ego in a lot of ways to expand society. And so we went from being hunters to farming to cities and nations that are just bigger farms. Why? Because that's how the ego works. That's how the ego functions, in the sense that the ego is based on fear. And so when you're based on fear of not survival and you're convinced that this is all there is, that's the path of lower resistance. The path of lower resistance, and the only thing you can do is to abuse others for you to exist, is to eat others for you to exist. And so with the ego, and in fact the ego is actually like theories of anthropologists and sociologists believe that the ego emerged initially when we started hunting animals, because humans had to organize in groups and be able to hunt together as a group. And to do that, they had to start being able to interact with one another and to have this self-image, in a sense, that they had with others for others to follow them, right? And so ultimately the ego started like that. The ego started with people choosing to hunt in fear of not surviving, choosing that instead of. And so every time is a choice, but the unsustainable choice is the choice of the ego every time. And so the unsustainable, why hunting is unsustainable, and in fact it leads to additional choices. Hunting is unsustainable because it leads to people to become dependent from meat. But meat is not there all the time, because animals walk around and, they migrate, they do things and blah, blah. And you can't really keep them. They're not plants. You can't grow an animal. You can grow plants. You cannot grow an animal. And so that choice has brought us to make other choices that were unsustainable, such as farming, because then you can't hunt all the time, but now you're dependent on meat for survival, because as the more you eat it, the more, genetically speaking, we have become dependent from meat for survival. And then humans had to start farming animals. But farming animals is different than hunting animals, because farmed animals go through a lot of pain. And initially it wasn't like that. Initially we have farmed for a lot of time without inflicting too much pain to animals. But now you see the mass farming is causing a lot of pain to the animals and to us, to those who eat them, because the meat of those animals contain a lot of pain, the pain and the trauma that animals go through. And so if we're trying to disperse our own trauma by eating that meat, we're really adding more trauma, because trauma takes the shape of molecules such as cortisol. Cortisol is the stress hormone. Like animals have oftentimes our same hormones. Our body is capable of recognizing animal hormones because they're the same a lot of times, especially mammals. So if we eat mammals that go through stress, we are simply adding more stress to our body. And our body, even if it doesn't recognize, if it doesn't use the molecules contained in a meat, like even if it can't use the cortisol or whatever stress hormone contained in an animal, still our body is designed, because we went through a lot of coevolution with all of these animals, our body is designed to recognize stress, to recognize fear, and to use it as a trigger for fear and for the ego and for the fight or flight mode. And so the more we eat those things, the more we're also getting that choice, like picking that choice, the choice of lies, the choice of unsustainability. And the more we ourselves and our body make that choice. And so that's how we develop illnesses and pathologies and cancer. So it has nothing to do with meat itself. It has more to do with mass farming and like all the kind of things that we eat when we massively farm. But this is the same in the sense that like it's always like eating meat is an unsustainable choice, because it's a way of really doing something that we then had to start farming for. And farming it should never happen. Like you should not farm from plants to animals. We should never farm, because farming on its own, it's really a way of not having something that is wild And something that is wild is a lot more nutritional and nourishing and good for us than farm things. Unfortunately, we don't have access to, we do have access, but most of us have completely lost the knowledge of foraging wild herbs, for example, like foraging things. And this is the same concept, in the sense that, like, you can always, like, I'm from the south of Italy, where we have this tradition of going to harvest things when it's season. And so berries, when it's berry seasons, we go and harvest berries, and we harvest a lot of them. We make jam, and we use that jam for the whole year. Chestnuts, we go and harvest chestnuts. Mushrooms, we go and harvest mushrooms. So all of these things are really wild. Obviously, there is a lot of farming where I'm from, in the sense that people do farm plants and animals and everything, really. But farming in general is really what causes us more trauma, because what is farming? And this is what society has become, a huge farm. What is farming? Farming means oppressing and preventing the universe from the proper expansion is supposed to have towards consciousness, because the universe is expanding to disperse the trauma of the Big Bang and to bloom into consciousness. But farming is a way of preventing that expansion, of oppressing those who are trying to emerge to consciousness, to allow consciousness to emerge. And so farming of humans, farming of animals, farming of anything is just a way of preventing that plant from blooming. And in fact, while in nature plants are allowed to, yes, create their leaves that we eat, but they also create the flowers, which are the parts that is really the blooming of the consciousness of the plant. And instead, when we farm those plants, we go through cycles of just cutting off and cutting off and cutting off and eating them and eating them and eating them. And we never allow the plant to bloom into its consciousness. So everything, and you'll see that you will get, like, we will start doing the same, like going against even like plants farming, because it's all about farming. The problem is that the universe is trying, and the earth is trying to disperse the trauma. And by not allowing it to disperse the trauma, by constantly making it grow things and then cut it, grow things and then cut it, cutting lives, cutting plants, killing animals, is the same concept. And every time that we just don't allow things to have their own evolution towards consciousness, we are oppressing the consciousness of the earth and of the universe from having their own natural blooming and expansion. That causes, because the energy of the trauma needs to be dispersed. And so if we don't allow the energy of the trauma to disperse in one way, it disperses in another way. And so that's why we have all of these wars. That's why we have all this climate change. That's why because of farming, because we are farming humans. What is humanity? What do you think humanity is? We're always the same. Like, we haven't evolved for a long time. No, the population has not evolved for a long time. There are people in power who are constantly trying to find ways of living longer and doing things. And there are a lot of people we don't even know they exist. They are not on the news. They don't go on the media. So people do evolve. Humanity keeps evolving, but it's the population that is kept oppressed all the time. This never-ending cycle in which they give us, alcohol and bars and all the same cycle, and rock music and then EDM and rock music and then EDM. All these cycles that go from, lesser conscious things to more conscious things and then death. Lesser conscious things and then more conscious things and then death. All of these cycles that we're forced to go through are really not a proper expansion that we should have. And every time people do become more conscious and try to expand more and to disperse their trauma, our system really oppresses them. Like, women have been burned as witches for a long time. Constantly, there are, like, now in Iran and in Afghanistan and in Arabia, and like in all of these countries where women are often oppressed, they are killed and oppressed because they are not covering their hair. Seriously, people are dying for very stupid reasons. And that's the oppression, right? That's the oppression that we're for, and that's the oppression that we're having in so many different ways in our society and as humans. And the same mechanisms are used by the ego also at the relational level with narcissistic abuse and all these sort of behaviors and toxic relationships, so-called toxic relationships. And then in our mind, the ego tries to keep us down and to farm us, to farm our thoughts, to feed the thoughts that make us feel good until we are in our ego, and then give us Stockholm syndrome, because yes, we feel bad, and most of the times we're depressed, but the ego allows us to go to a bar and feel pretty and receive compliments. So that's how the ego, is tricking us into keeping the ego active instead of killing it. Because the ego is like a parasite. The ego is like an idea that is a parasite. So even Richard Dawkins, I'm mentioning a lot of books today. Richard Dawkins is a scientist who wrote The Selfish Gene, and it's a great book that I suggest everybody to read, and it really tells you how the evolution works. He talks about Darwinian evolution, but also it's very interesting how he describes how he understood. And like, I was reading his book, and before getting to that chapter, I had already thought the same thing. And as I opened the next chapter, I was like, wow, I had the same intuition. So he said that the next level of evolution, other than our body, would have been ideas. So now, as humans, we're capable of creating ideas, of writing ideas, of communicating ideas, right? And so now the next level of evolution for humanity is not anymore just the body, the genetic level is the level of ideas, and ideas way more long-lasting than bodies. And so we already are evolving in that sense. We have done that for a long time. Even just think of it, the idea of Jesus. We have been thinking about it for 2,000 years, So it's an idea that has spread so much that now it's just evolutionarily perfect, and it's just spreading because it's the truth, right? But that's what it means, the idea. There's so many ideas that unfortunately spread that are unsustainable, like the idea of Nazism. It's another idea that unfortunately today is very current, and we are in a Nazi regime already for a lot of different reasons, so we don't realize that. And so this is all the ideas that spread, the ideas that are like lies that spread all the time. And so what is the ego ultimately? The ego is an idea. So the ego is the idea. It starts with the idea of being separate. And so you see how all of these steps that I have been talking about so far ultimately come down to the idea of being separate. Because from that idea, the fractal that stems is exactly what we have today. And it's exactly why the Big Bang has been the trauma that caused it. Because the idea of being separate is the idea that then once you are in the world and you need to, to exist, you're like, I am separate. I need to make this body survive as long as possible because I am this body. I'm not the universe. I am separate. I am this body. And so I need to feed it. And so you feed this body that is just this drop of sauce that detached. And instead of being like, oh, I can't wait to go back to the source, you're like, I have to feed this now. I have to feed this and to protect it. So the idea of separation is what created the ego in the first place. And then the same idea of the separation, when put in front of the choice, do I eat this animal or not? Obviously, I eat it because I need to feed this body. I'm separate. Nobody is taking care of me other than myself. The universe doesn't take care of me. The earth doesn't take care of me, right? Why not? There's so much abundance in the earth. But no, the earth is not taking care of me. And sometimes it stems from trauma, maybe people who started hunting were people who found themselves in a very dry land with no plants or in a very, very difficult circumstances. But ultimately, that's exactly the point, that it is fear. It is fear and the idea of separation together that give rise to the ego. And then once you get there and you start hunting animals, you're like, Again, I'm separate. I need these animals. What do I do with it? I can't hunt them all the time. I have to farm them, and then you start farming them. And it's the same way as how narcissistic abuse works, because narcissistic abuse follows the same exact things. It's like there are people who go hunting, and then at the higher level go hunting, like, the perfect victim, and then at the higher level, at the organizational level, like governments and corporations, they don't hunt anymore. They farm because it's a smarter idea for them. Because in their idea in which they are separate, they truly believe that they're separate from the population that they're abusing. They forgot that they're just the same being. They just forgot. And so this is the ego. The ego then ultimately turns into farming people, farming animals, farming things, and creating this conglomerate of bubbles that are ultimately these separate beings, or these separate, like imagine really these bubbles that are our apartments, like if you take a bath and all the bubbles form on the surface, and the foam grows. That's really how the universe works. When you have this kind of like turmoil on the earth, the natural expression of that turmoil inside of the earth is that you form bubbles on the surface. And that's exactly what is happening. So this is really a reflection of the trauma that from the inside of the earth is dispersing towards its surface. And so we need to disperse it. And so sometimes in certain areas, because it's also a matter of parts of the earth, there are certain areas that have a volcano, and so that's because there is a lot of turmoil under that area, and so other parts don't have that much turmoil, and so they create different kinds of things, and so they, based on the areas, on the patch of the earth where we are an expression. Our society is being capable of, or not, of dispersing that trauma. And maybe some people move, to a different space, and they come from lineages that had a lot of trauma to disperse, right? And so then they finally get to a part that is lesser traumatized, and they start farming those people that are very docile and nice and kind, because they come from a frugal mentality, from hostility, from an idea of separation. And so this is really how the entire world really works. And it's all about the ego and trauma. It's all about dispersing the trauma and understanding that this ego that we have created on top is just a false idea that it's spreading because it feeds us and it makes us believe of being special for allowing it to keep working and to keep spreading. And it doesn't make any sense. It's causing a lot of issues in our society. So we need to start healing that. We need to start overcoming our ego. And again, it goes in layers. Initially, you awaken from the part that you had played in a toxic relationship, and that was the ego that had been given to you. And then you awaken from the part that the ego, the collective ego of society, is given to you, and then you peel off that layer too. And then you start seeing your own ego that you keep perpetuating because you are afraid of facing the truth that sometimes you have been abusing others, or sometimes you have been abusing yourself, or sometimes you have allowed things to slip away from your consciousness on purpose because you're a little bit masochistic. So there's so many reasons why we are our own, we're the perpetrator of trauma against ourselves or against others. And so that's the part that really is the hardest to reach. And that once you reach that, everything falls off, I think, because really at that point it becomes all a matter of starting, and you already are on that journey, but like starting walking towards the journey of awakening to consciousness. And at that point is inevitable, because once you get rid of all of these layers that the ego creates, then you're like, I have no other purpose. I have no other purpose than going towards consciousness, because all the egoic purposes I believed in are gone. What am I doing here other than wanting to heal and to become another piece of the earth and of the universe that has healed? That's my only purpose now, healing myself. And once I heal myself, I want to make sure that others can follow. So that's exactly what I'm doing right now with this podcast and with this season, in which I want to give you guys all different kinds of stories of people who have awakened and who have had ego deaths of various kinds or trauma healing of various kinds, so that no matter where you're at right now and where you're at in your life, what kind of upbringing you had, what kind of job you have, what kind of things you do, what kind of relationships you're in, or where you're from, all of these things don't matter. So all of the people that I interview are always people who have all kinds of stories coming from all kinds of backgrounds, but all of them reach the same end point, which is the only end point that exists, which is awakening, which is healing, which is understanding that we are one. And everybody is at different stages of this. And again, it depends a lot on our brain's capability of reaching that consciousness, but also on, what life brings to us. And ultimately, every one of us has a different setting, a different configuration, that, as I said at the very beginning, the different configuration of these cylinders that our egoic layers are. And based on that configuration, some people can keep going, and some people really are like, okay, I can go until here, and then from now on I'm gonna skew this layer 45 degrees and keep thinking that that's okay because I can't go past it. And so some people stop early, some people get to the very end of it, some people keep going, some people, the journey never ends. And so it's really about us, what we do, it's our choices. And it's all about, I heard a phrase that was actually very interesting from The Matrix. The Oracle, at some point, she says, we cannot see, nobody can see past the choices that they cannot make. And this is exactly what it is about. Because the ego is about choosing the truth. And so if you choose the truth, if you know you can make the choice of truth, then you can see past and you can keep going your journey towards consciousness. If you don't know what choice you're gonna make because you're afraid of that choice, you're afraid of having to choose the light or the truth or whatever the lie, then you can't see past it and you stay in the comfort zone that has created, and you never choose past. You decide, yeah, I don't want to know anything more, I'm okay here, right? And that corresponds to also choosing a lie, but also to not see a lie at the same time, to not realign with the full truth. So that's a pity. But a lot of people can't, go past it. And there are a lot of people who have like very deep trauma who don't really understand what the trauma came from. For example, people who had sexual abuse when they were little kids from their parents, and that's such a heavy thing to swallow sometimes, that is really like a lot of people deny that, or things that we don't remember, or like a lot of people do so many wrongdoings, quote unquote wrongdoings in their lives. They make that choice of traumatizing others or eating others, instead of choosing the light so many times in their life, that then they create this shell around them that now it's like a trap, it's like a cage for them, and now they have to keep going with that lie. And so there's so many reasons why a lot of people don't really choose to keep going in this journey. But seriously, guys, you should keep going. This is like an advice for everybody. It's just beautiful to keep going, because if you stay stuck, you really feel you're stuck. You're like, you can't possibly feel fully happy and fulfilled and joyful until you decide to stay in the previous comfort zone. You need to keep going in a way or in another to get to the very root of the source of your problems and of your ego, so that you finally get back to consciousness. And yeah, because it's about getting back to consciousness. We were conscious at the beginning, we just have lost it through this hyperbolic trajectory that we went through as part of the creation of our ego, of our body. And so now we gotta go back. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. And it's like, it sounds initially all over the place, but it's really because the ego is not just one thing, like it's a lot of different things, a lot of different mechanisms, and there are a lot of different ways to talk about it from physical, physiological, psychological, sociological standpoint. It's all about that, and it's really what my book is about. So I suggest you, if you really are interested in this topic, to check it out. And you can find it on my website. I'm going to put the link on this at the description as well. And you can find me at 360holisticcoach.com, where you can find also my events and all the things that I do. And you can find me on Instagram, although I don't really take care as much as I would like to of my Instagram page at 360holistic.coach. So thank you so much for joining, and I'll see you next time. We're going to have an interview. Bye-bye.